everyone. I'm Jen Lugton from Sydney, Australia, and I'm going to talk to you guys today about how to take perfect podiatry radiographs. So a little bit of background about me. I graduated from Sydney University in 2007, and I've only ever worked in equine practice. I am currently running my own solo business where I have about 80% of my workload being podiatry focused. I think one of the best things about podiatry radiographs, when you're methodical and repeatable images, they're always going to be easier for us to interpret. And this will actually train our brain in terms of picking up on abnormalities easier. It's also when we want another vet's opinion, when we might be sending to a referring veterinarian, it's going to be easier for them to interpret our images when they're better quality. And I think lastly, but most importantly, is vet to farrier. I think a lot of farriers will judge our skills on the quality of our radiographs, and we don't want to be the vet that sends them crappy images that they can't interpret. I think we will gain a lot of respect from the farriers with good quality images, and they're more likely to work with us and to recommend our services. So I think this is really important. So today we're going to cover the difference between veterinary and podiatry specific radiographs. We're going to review some useful radiographic principles. We're going to talk about the equipment needed to perform these radiographs, and then we're going to look at some examples of different radiographs throughout. Okay, so veterinary versus podiatry specific radiographs. With veterinary x-rays, we're often investigating a lameness. We might be focusing on specific areas such as the coffin joint or the navicular bone. And we're going to be using specialty views and radiographic techniques, such as this example here of the radiograph where we have increased bone detail to highlight the outline of the navicular bone and also that cystic structure inside the navicular bone. With podiatry radiographs, these are also termed farrier-friendly x-rays because we are taking these for consultation with a farrier. We want to provide the information that the farrier needs to assess this foot. They therefore focus on the shoe and the solar aspect of the foot, and they typically include 2 views per hoof, a lateromedial and a DP dorsopalmar plantar image. And one of the biggest differences, we often would like soft tissue detail. We want to see the entire hoof capsule and how it relates to the foot. So with our podiatry radiographs, we need to ask ourselves, what information do the farriers need and what do we want to measure on our images? This is one of the farriers that I work regularly with. We do a lot of custom therapeutic work on performance horses. And when we're working with the farriers, measurements are really important. As you can see here, we have an angle meter sitting on top of this shoe, and we will measure the initial radiographs. We'll come up with a plan, then we'll measure our shoe, then we're going to apply that shoe to the foot, and then we're going to measure our radiographs again. And here is a list of the common measurements we like to take from our podiatry radiographs, and we'll work through these now. The first one being the bone angle. The bone angle is a measure of the angle of the pedal bone itself. So we're taking one angle of the dorsal surface of the pedal bone, and the other one is the palmar or plantar surface of the pedal bone. And this is a really important angle to measure, as the pedal bone will provide the framework to that horse's foot and will often dictate the conformation of that horse's foot. It's a measurement that can vary wildly amongst different feet. I've seen anywhere from a 38-degree bone angle up to a 60-degree bone angle, and I've seen up to 10 degrees variation between a left foot and a right front foot. And this is important because it can help take some pressure off our farriers. If you've got a horse with a really low 40-degree bone angle and that client's complaining that the farrier needs to stand the horse up and shorten its toe, and you can help advise them that they have a horse with a lower than average bone angle, it will help take a little bit of pressure off the farrier by lowering that client's expectations. And also if we have a horse with a really high bone angle and they think that their horse has a club foot and it's been managed poorly by the farrier and the farrier just needs to lower the heels, they can understand that that angle is actually being generated by that horse's bone, and that is a static angle which will not change, and the farrier doesn't have control over that. So I think this is a really important x-ray that I'd like to see everyone consider a lot more. Next we have the palmar angle. This is palmar angle for the front feet and plantar angle for the hind feet, and this is an angle of the palmar surface of the pedal bone relative to the guide wire in your x-ray blocks, which delineates the angle of the ground. This is a very easy angle to measure, and we very commonly measure this angle in our radiographs. The only word of caution is if you have a lot of remodeling at the apex, then I just move this angle back and just measure the angle of the wings of the pedal bone, not the area of the pedal bone that's undergone remodeling, as the remodeling will often occur parallel to the forces that are applied to it. If you have a lot of remodeling, just measure the angle of the wings of the pedal bone. Next we have the hoof angle, and this is a measurement of the angle of the dorsal hoof wall relative to the ground. Just a word of caution when measuring this angle, if we have any changes to the dorsal hoof wall, either a farrier has rasped too much off or we have a dish in the dorsal hoof wall, then you need to take this into consideration. If I have a large dish, I will just move my measurement proximally on the hoof and measure the area of straight hoof wall and not the area of flared hoof wall. And again, if the farrier has taken a lot of excess wall off, then again, just try to measure proximally. Next we have the coronary extensor distance. This is a measurement from the coronary band down to the extensor process of the pedal bone, and we often use this measurement in our laminitis cases. With soft tissue detail, I think I can see the coronary band on my radiographs. However, it is a measurement where I think it can be more accurate if you use a marker placed externally on that coronary band. However, in saying that, I tend not to rely on this measurement for my laminitis cases very much, so I don't tend to measure this one as much anymore. I think it's been superseded by measuring our lamellar zone, which we'll get to shortly, and also looking for other evidence in the hoof capsule of sinking, such as a shelf that you'll commonly see in a sinker. And you can see here on this x-ray of a horse with sinking laminitis, where the arrow's pointing, you can see this different profile to that coronary band, and we call this the coronary shelf when we have distal displacement of that pedal bone inside the hoof capsule. And then you can just see down here I've got one measurement on my lamellar zone, which that lamellar zone should be between 7 and 8 millimeters, and here you can see it's actually 9.7. I don't tend to measure the CE distance. I'm looking for that contour of the coronary band itself, and I'm more interested in my lamellar zone. Then we have our sole depth. The sole depth is taken from the solar aspect of the pedal bone at the apex of the pedal bone down to the end of the live sole. I think you've got to be careful with this image too. Some people like to take it from the tip of the pedal bone, but if you have any kind of remodeling, this will change. Just my general rule for taking this measurement is to take it from the lowest part of the pedal bone. And as long as you are repeatable in how you measure your sole depth, then you can track these horses. And it's a very good measurement for farriers to know, because they're going to know how much foot they have to work with. And also when we can see the entire sole with our soft tissue detail, we're going to know whether or not the thin sole is a cause of lameness itself. The other thing about knowing our sole depth is it's going to dictate what our response to hoof testers will be. So if we have a very thin sole, then I would expect to see an increased response to hoof testers. If we have a very thick sole, I might still have pathology, but I'm going to have a diminished response to hoof testers. Here we have the sole cup. The sole cup is the air between the sole and the shoe. And this is an important measurement to take because it also dictates to us the profile of that sole. So do we have a flat sole, a dropped sole, or a nice normal concave sole? When we have no sole cup present, this will often mean we have pressure of that sole pushing against the shoe, and this will be a cause of lameness itself. And if we have a large sole cup, then there's a fair amount that the farrier has to work with. And they say that about 1 millimeter of sole cup is like 3 millimeters of sole depth. So we certainly want to see nice sole cups in our radiographs. Okay, then we have the digital breakover. This is a measurement taken from the tip of the pedal bone, and we run that forward to the breakover point of the shoe or the hoof. And ideally this measurement is as close to zero as possible, but more commonly it's a centimeter or two forward. Next we have the laminar zone, and this is some very important measurements for our laminitis cases. You can see here two measurements of this laminar zone, and the laminar zone itself is part of the HL zone. The HL zone is the horn of the hoof wall plus the laminar zone. I tend to just measure my laminar zone, although this will be different amongst different clinicians, and some people will prefer to measure the entire HL zone, whereas I like to just measure my laminar zone. With this measurement, I like to take one proximal measurement and one distal measurement, and these measurements for your average size thoroughbred should be between 7 and 8 millimeters. They should be relatively parallel down that dorsal surface of the pedal bone. With rotation, what we expect to see is a widening of the laminar zone as we course distally down the foot. Another way you can measure the degree of rotation is then to measure the angle of how much divergence you get in that lamellar zone. And the other thing to be mindful of is when we have a sinker and that laminar zone can stay parallel, but it might just widen. Instead of being 7 or 8 millimeters, we might end up at 9 or 10 or even 12 millimeters. But if you first glance at that foot quickly, you might not think the horse has laminitis, and then when you start to measure, you can see that actually the lamellar zone has increased by a couple of millimeters, and that might be what you need to convince the client that you need to do more to save this horse's life early on with a possible sinker. Andrew Van Epps has looked at this lamellar zone in more detail, and he believes that the lamellar zone should comprise about 40 to 42% of the total HL zone. And here's a case study looking at monitoring that lamellar zone. This was a contralateral limb laminitis secondary to a septic fracture on the other limb. On the radiograph on the left, you can see that early on this lamellar zone was 7.7 proximally, and it was actually narrower distally. This was due to having her set up in this therapeutic device, which took tension out of that deep flexor tendon as a preventative measure. And then once the laminitis started and progressed, then you can see that this lamellar zone widened to about 9.7, so a 2 millimeter increase in width, even though the lamellar zone stayed parallel itself. And again, you can see that shelf up on the coronary band. Next, we have the centre of articulation, the COA, and you'll hear this talked about a lot amongst different groups with assessing horses' balance around the centre of articulation. So to take this measurement, we drop a plumb line down through the centre of the distal end of P2, and we course that towards the ground. And then we want to take a ratio of the weight-bearing surface in front of this line to the weight-bearing surface behind this line. And in an ideal world, we have this ratio about 50-50. In the low-heeled long-toe horses, it may be closer to 60% out the front and 40% out the back. And then our medial-lateral balance. This is important on our DP images, and we can measure quite a few things. We can look at the measurements of the joint. I've got some markers here just looking at the rim balance. We can measure the symmetry of the pedal bone. We can look at the coronary band heights. If we maybe have a sheared heel, we might have one coronary band higher than the other, and I will often use barium for these images in those cases. And we can also look at the wall angles of both that medial and lateral wall. Okay, and now for the fun stuff, reviewing our X-ray principles. The first one I wanted to talk about is our focal beam orientation, and I drew this lovely picture to help show this. And the focal beam is the only X-ray beams which are truly straight. So these are our central beams as seen in this image, and then all the beams either side of this, which are the dotted lines, will diverge as they head towards our subject and our plate. So the importance of this is that we need to aim our focal beam where we want to measure. So when we look at our Bentley radiograph on the left where we are looking at a coffin joint, you can see that the shoe is now oblique because our beams either side of our focal beam are now diverging. Whereas this X-ray on the right, which is our podiatry image where we're focusing on the solar aspect of the foot, the shoe is aligned and the wings of the pedal bone are also aligned. The second X-ray principle is to reduce magnification, and in order to do this we want to have the plate as close to the foot as possible. So you can see on the image on the left I've got the foot on the edge of the block, and then we have a gap between the foot and the plate, whereas the image on the right we have the foot as close to the plate as possible. And this is so that we get minimal divergence of that beam once it passes through the subject and then heads towards that plate. And this is just an example of what we might see on the radiograph when we have the foot away from the plate. So on the left we have our normal image of the plate close to the foot, and then the image on the right is the same foot just with that 2-inch gap between the plate and the foot. You can see here we have now some magnification of that foot, and instead of being able to see the guide wire underneath the shoe, we now have the shoe overlapping that guide wire. So any measurements that we wanted to take using that guide wire might be a little bit trickier. Our third X-ray principle is to reduce distortion, and this is a balancing act between reducing magnification and reducing distortion. While it's tempting to tuck our plate in underneath the distal limb like the image seen on, I think it's important that we don't do this, as even though this might reduce our magnification, it will create some distortion, so it's always important to keep our plate perpendicular to the X-ray beam. Okay, and the fourth X-ray principle is our KVP and our MAS. So KVP, kilovoltage peak, is our quality and our contrast of our images, and our milliamp per second is our quantity and exposure of our images. And with the podiatry-specific radiographs, we really want that soft tissue detail. So we're going to decrease our KVP a little bit, and I tend to lower my MAS even more. So the top image is an overexposed radiograph where we can't see the outline of the hoof wall. This means that we can no longer see where our coronary band is. We wouldn't be able to see if there was a shelf. We can't see our growth rings or our wall angle, which is the hoof angle. We can't measure the thickness of the dorsal wall. We can't see how much the barrier has removed. And importantly, we can no longer measure the ratio of the HL zone. While I can still see my L zone there, we might not be able to measure the ratio, which Van Ness is an advocate for. And moving on to what